UCLA. Apparently, Michael Jackson suffered cardiac arrest this afternoon. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center.
The three people who got rich from Michael Jackson. June 25, 2009. Michael Jackson died owing close to $500 million. His estate was, by every conventional measure, a financial disaster waiting to be picked apart by creditors. Reporters at the time speculated about bankruptcy. Lawyers speculated about a decade of lawsuits. Almost nobody predicted what actually happened next, because in the years that followed his death, Michael Jackson's name generated more money than it ever had while he was alive. Not millions, billions of dollars, flowing out of a catalog, an estate, and a legacy that he could no longer control or benefit from personally. Somebody had to manage that money. Somebody had to make the decisions about where it went, which deals to sign, which assets to sell, and which assets to protect. And the people who ended up holding that power walked away from Michael Jackson's death wealthier than almost anyone could have predicted in the chaotic weeks after he died. This is the story of the people who got rich from Michael Jackson. Not from his music in the simple way fans get value from his music, by listening to it and loving it. Rich from decisions made about his estate, his catalog, and his name after he was no longer there to make those decisions for himself. Two of them he chose personally, years before he died, trusting them with authority that would only matter once he was gone. The third was a corporation that ended up owning, outright, the very thing he had spent decades building and fighting to protect. All three of them are now significantly wealthier because Michael Jackson's trusted the right people. Or because Michael Jackson's name became something that could be bought, managed, and sold for extraordinary profit. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a man who died nearly $500 million in debt became, within a few short years, one of the highest earning entertainers on the planet, dead or alive. And you will understand exactly who benefited from making that happen. Branca's history and his payout, John Bra, had worked with Michael Jackson on and off since the late 1970s. He was the entertainment lawyer who, in 1985, advised Michael Jackson to buy the ATV music publishing catalog, the deal that brought a large portion of the Beatles' songwriting library under Michael Jackson's ownership for a price of $47.5 million. At the time, that price seemed enormous for a catalog of older songs. Many people in the music industry questioned whether it made financial sense. Branca believed otherwise, and he pushed Michael Jackson to make the purchase, despite the skepticism surrounding it. That single piece of advice turned out to be one of the most consequential business decisions in the history of the music industry. The ATV catalog eventually merged with Sony's own publishing arm in 1995 to form Sony ATV Music Publishing, a joint venture in which Michael Jackson held a 50% ownership stake. By the time of his death in 2009, that stake alone was estimated by financial analysts to be worth close to $1 billion. Branca and Michael Jackson did not have a simple, uninterrupted working relationship across those decades. They worked together, parted ways more than once, and came back together again, multiple times across nearly 30 years. There were periods where Michael Jackson fired Branca entirely, only to rehire him again, later when new legal and financial complications arose that required his specific expertise. In the months before Michael Jackson's death, during the preparation for the This Is It tour, Branca had once again been brought back into Michael Jackson's inner circle. Michael Jackson's final will, signed in 2002, named Branca as a co-executor of his entire estate, alongside longtime family friend and music executive John McClain. When Michael Jackson died owing roughly $400 million, Branca and McClain inherited a financial mess that most professionals in their position would have considered close to unmanageable. Creditors were owed enormous sums. The estate's most valuable assets were tied up in complicated ownership structures. Family members were already preparing to contest the will itself. What Branca and McClain actually did with that situation became one of the most remarkable turnaround stories in modern entertainment business history. As co-executor, Branca was legally entitled to executor fees calculated based on the value of the estate he was actively managing and growing. Court filings made public over the following years showed those fees accumulating into the tens of millions of dollars. In 2016, a probate court formally approved combined executor fees for Branca and McClain that, according to reporting at the time, were valued at approximately $90 million split between the two of them, a figure that directly reflected the extraordinary growth the estate had experienced under their joint management. Branca did not simply collect a fee and step back from active involvement. He was personally and directly involved in negotiating many of the specific deals that generated that growth. The Cirque du Soleil shows built around Michael Jackson's music. The extended Sony recording contract reportedly worth $250 million. The eventual sale of Michael Jackson's remaining share of Sony ATV back to Sony itself. Each of these deals generated substantial new revenue for the estate, and the compensation structure for the executors managing them was directly tied to that same revenue growth. McClain's role in earnings. John McClain's relationship with Michael Jackson looked very different from Branca's relationship from the very beginning. McClain had known Michael Jackson since they were both children. He was a respected music executive in his own right, having worked at A&M Records and later at other major recording labels throughout a long career in the industry, and he had remained a close personal friend of the entire Jackson family for decades. When Michael Jackson wrote his final will in 2002, he chose McClain as co-executor specifically because of that deep personal trust, not simply because of his professional credentials, though those credentials certainly made him qualified to handle the responsibility as well. Michael Jackson wanted someone managing his legacy after death who genuinely understood him as a person, not only as a commercial asset. Following Michael Jackson's death, McClain found himself managing the exact same overwhelming financial situation that Branca faced: the enormous outstanding debt, the deeply contested family relationships, the years of ongoing litigation that followed almost immediately, as different members of the Jackson family challenged various aspects of the will itself and questioned the authority that had been granted to the two executors. McClain's financial compensation followed a structure very similar to Branca's, tied directly to executor fees that required formal approval through the probate court process, as the overall value of the estate continued to grow under their joint management. The combined approximately $90 million in fees approved for both executors in 2016 reflected years of intensive work that had transformed the estate from a financial liability into one of the single most valuable entertainment estates anywhere in the world. Beyond the direct executor fees themselves, McClain's position also gave him significant ongoing influence over major decisions involving Michael Jackson's musical legacy, including the handling of posthumous releases and the careful management of a large amount of previously unreleased material that Michael Jackson had recorded across different periods of his career. These decisions themselves generated substantial additional revenue for the estate over time, and that revenue, in turn, helped justify the continued executor compensation that was directly tied to it. What makes McClain's story particularly notable within this larger narrative is the deeply personal dimension running through it. He was not simply a hired outside professional brought in after the fact to manage unfamiliar assets. He was someone who had known Michael Jackson as a young child, who had attended the same family events for decades, whose relationship with the Jackson family predated any formal business arrangement by a very long time. That personal history did not prevent him from benefiting substantially and financially from the specific role he ended up playing in managing everything Michael Jackson left behind. Both Branca and McClain have faced public criticism over the years from certain members of the Jackson family, particularly Michael Jackson's own father, Joe Jackson, during his lifetime, who argued at various points that the executors were prioritizing their own financial interests over the family's wishes. The executors and their representatives have consistently defended their record by pointing to the dramatic, well-documented financial turnaround the estate experienced specifically under their management, arguing that the results themselves justify both their decisions and their compensation. The actual financial strategy explained. To really understand how Branca and McClain generated the kind of value that justified tens of millions of dollars in combined executor fees, you have to understand the specific strategy they pursued from the very earliest days of managing Michael Jackson's estate. Starting almost immediately after his death, their first and most urgent priority was preventing what is sometimes called a fire sale. When someone dies owing approximately $400 million, the natural instinct of many creditors is to demand rapid liquidation of available assets in order to recover what they are owed as quickly as possible, often at significantly discounted prices. Branca and McClain worked aggressively to resist this pressure. They negotiated extended repayment terms with creditors that bought the estate critical time that allowed the single most valuable asset, the Sony ATV catalog stake, to continue generating steady revenue rather than being sold off hastily at a depressed price under financial duress. Their second major strategic move involved actively activating value that had previously been dormant. The This Is It documentary, assembled from rehearsal footage that existed only because of the tour Michael Jackson never got the chance to actually perform, generated over $400 million at the global box office following its release in late 2009. A Cirque du Soleil show, built specifically around his catalog of music, became a long-running, consistently profitable attraction in Las Vegas. New recording agreements were carefully negotiated with Sony covering previously unreleased material that had been sitting unused in archives for years. Each of these individual moves required active, hands-on business decisions, extensive negotiation, and continuous professional management, exactly the kind of demanding work that executor compensation structures are specifically designed to reward financially. The estate was never simply sitting passively and collecting routine royalty checks. It was being deliberately and aggressively built into a fully functioning media and licensing business in its own right, almost as if Michael Jackson himself were still an active, working artist generating new projects every year. By 2018, Forbes magazine reported that Michael Jackson's estate had generated well over $2 billion in total cumulative revenue since his death, a figure that consistently placed him among the highest-earning deceased celebrities anywhere in the world, year after year, often out-earning many prominent living artists during the same periods. The crushing debt that had once seriously threatened to consume the entire estate had been steadily paid down and was eventually eliminated completely. And the two executors who had personally managed and overseen that entire remarkable transformation were compensated according to court-approved fee structures that were directly and explicitly tied to the scale of the financial turnaround they had achieved. The better the estate performed financially under their management, the more they themselves stood to earn through the approved fee structure, creating a direct financial incentive that aligned closely with the actual interests of the estate and its eventual beneficiaries. Introducing the third beneficiary, Sony, the catalog buyer angle. The third major beneficiary of Michael Jackson's posthumous financial empire was not an individual person in quite the same direct sense as Branca and McClain. It was Sony, and more specifically, the long-running corporate relationship that ultimately turned Michael Jackson's original catalog investment into one of the single most valuable assets the company has ever owned in its history. In 2016, Sony formally purchased the remaining 50% stake in Sony ATV Music Publishing that had belonged to Michael Jackson's estate since his death, paying approximately $750 million to acquire it completely. This single transaction alone represented one of the largest music publishing acquisitions in the entire history of the recording industry, and it gave Sony full, complete, undivided ownership of a catalog that included not only a substantial portion of the Beatles' songbook, but also tens of thousands of additional songs that had been carefully accumulated over many decades of acquisitions. The senior executives and decision-makers at Sony, who structured, negotiated, and ultimately approved that significant acquisition, and who have continued to actively manage the combined Sony music publishing catalog in the years since, have overseen an asset that continues to generate enormous, reliable, recurring revenue every single year long after the original purchase price was fully paid out. Music publishing catalogs of this particular scale and quality have become some of the most actively sought after and consistently valuable assets in the entire global entertainment industry, generating predictable income streams through streaming royalties, synchronization licensing for major film and television productions, and ongoing widespread commercial use across countless different platforms. While Sony is, of course, a corporation rather than a single identifiable individual, the practical financial reality is that this particular acquisition, built directly on the foundation that Michael Jackson and John Branca originally established back in 1985 when the ATV catalog was first purchased for $47.5 million, has become one of the most consistently profitable assets within Sony's entire entertainment portfolio today. The relationship between Michael Jackson's original catalog investment decades earlier and Sony's eventual complete ownership of that exact same catalog represents one of the clearest, most well-documented examples in modern entertainment history of how a single bold decision, made decades earlier by one visionary individual, can ultimately generate enormous and lasting financial value for an entirely different party, long after the person who made the original decision has passed away and is no longer able to benefit from it personally. It is worth pausing here to consider the full scale of that irony. Michael Jackson fought for years, sometimes publicly and angrily, to maintain his ownership stake in that catalog, viewing it as one of his most important and most protected assets. He resisted enormous financial pressure throughout his life to sell it off prematurely. And yet, within just a few short years of his death, that exact stake was sold by his own estate through deals negotiated by his own chosen executors, ultimately landing entirely in the hands of the very corporation he had spent so much of his career working alongside and, at times, openly criticizing. Wrap up and final thought 3. Very different relationships to Michael Jackson. 2 trusted executors that he personally selected years in advance, specifically to manage his entire estate after his eventual death. 1 massive global corporation that ended up owning, completely and outright, the exact catalog he had spent decades of his life building, protecting, and fighting to keep. All 3 ultimately turned a financial situation that began with nearly $500 million in outstanding debt into one of the single most valuable and most actively managed entertainment legacies anywhere in modern history. John Branca and John McClain were compensated through formal, court-approved executor fees that reached into the tens of millions of dollars combined, fees that were directly and explicitly tied to the remarkable scale of the financial turnaround they personally engineered. Sony, meanwhile, walked away owning, completely and permanently, a music publishing catalog now worth many times more than what it originally paid to acquire that final remaining 50% stake. None of this happened by simple accident or by passive good fortune. It happened because of specific, deliberate business decisions, specific carefully structured negotiations, and specific legal and financial strategies that were executed by people who understood precisely what they were managing and
it's not easy,
precisely
though.
how to grow it
Michael,
into
one more
something
time, I
far more
couldn't hear you,
valuable
sir.
than it had ever.
The inner
been
ears are
before.
very difficult
Michael
for
Jackson
me when you're
himself
raised
built the original foundation,
to use
the music,
just your
the
real
catalog,
own,
the globally
oral
recognized
oratory
name that
ears.
still means something profound to hundreds of millions of people all around the world, even now, more than 15 years after his death. What happened after his death, however, is a genuinely different story entirely. A story specifically about the people who took that foundation he built and systematically turned it into one of the most profitable entertainment legacies the global industry has ever witnessed. So here is the real question worth sitting with. Was this outcome, this remarkable financial transformation, ultimately a tribute to Michael Jackson's enduring genius and lasting cultural impact? Or was it simply proof of how much money can be extracted from a famous name once the person behind that name is no longer present to control, question, or push back against any of the decisions being made in it? What do you think about how Michael Jackson's estate was managed after his death, and who you believe truly deserved to benefit most from everything he built during his lifetime? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there is still so much more of this story worth telling.